All right, so I decided to make a little main idea video. And as opposed to the videos I've been doing up to this point, where it's more looking at one problem or at a time or one passage at a time, I wanted to talk a little bit more about reading comp strategy, specifically for main idea questions. Main idea questions is something that we know for sure we're going to see on the exam. There's 4 passages, and almost every passage is accompanied by a main idea question. So obviously it behooves us to become skilled at this question type. If you're exceptional at main idea questions, that's 3 or 4 questions correct on your verbal section right there. So let's dive into how we can improve on this question type. So the main thing with main idea questions that makes them challenging is they're asking about the passage as a whole. They often have language like, what's the primary purpose of the passage? And it's not really something you can go back for. If you haven't figured out what the main idea or the primary purpose is as you read the passage the first time, you're not suddenly going to be able to figure it out later in the midst of a question. So one of the things that is helpful is to understand that all GMAT passages fall into one of 3 categories. They're either purely informational, they are what I consider I+, which means they're informational, but they do give a tiny bit of opinion, or they are full-on persuasive passages. So let's look at each of these. So informational passages, here the author he gives no personal information whatsoever. He's not offering a point of view. He may mention opinions, but he'll always mention the opinions in the context of other people. There might be language like, some scientists or, proponents of theory A believe, but he never personally weighs in himself or gives his own thoughts. Those are probably the most common GMAT passages, to be honest. The passages on the GMAT are not too thrilling or opinionated or exciting. Then we've got informational with some opinion, I+ passages. So these are passages where it is mostly informational. It might be 75% or even 90% informational, but there is a little bit of opinion. Sometimes you'll see a passage where it's 4 paragraphs and 3 of the paragraphs are informational, and in the last paragraph, the author kind of gives a sentence or 2 of opinion, and those would be I+ passages. And then our last passage type is persuasive, P. These are the most rare. There really are not very many persuasive and strongly opinionated passages on the GMAT. When there is a persuasive passage, the author does have an opinion and it's quite clear. Sometimes it could be positive, and encouraging, but more likely it's going to be critical. All right, so strategy tip. Be careful not to confuse I+ and P. So what happens sometimes is in the scenario that I was just mentioning, where let's say we have 4 paragraphs, the first 3 paragraphs are informational, you get to the 4th paragraph and there's some opinion. How do you know whether it's I+ or P? And I would say, think of the rule of 3. If a passage is truly persuasive, there needs to be at least 3 sentences that contain an opinion, and hopefully more, hopefully 4 or 5. If the author really only has 1 sentence of opinion, but every other sentence is basically just factual information, it's not a persuasive passage. Most of the time, students will think it's persuasive when it's really just I+. So the error tends to go in that direction. People over-prescribe opinion. So keep that in mind. And if you're ever on the fence between I+ and P, default to I+. A great way to practice this technique, even if you have already done all of the official guide passages, is to go back and assign either a symbol I+ or P to each of them. Look at the structure, break them down into what category that you feel they would fit. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about main idea questions. So we need to get the passage categorization right. We need to know if it's I+, or P. The other thing that you need to do as you're reading the passage to help you identify that main idea is look for any keywords at all that express emotion or help you understand the author's point of view. So go ahead and hit pause on this video and check out passage 1. And when you are done reading it, you can read it either here in the slide, or you can look up this passage on GMATClub. But when you're done reading it, come back. All right, so hopefully you're done reading the passage. So on this next slide, I highlighted in red the words that I would consider important keywords that relate to the author's tone. You know, it starts out, we're talking about human beings. And then the second sentence starts with this really interesting transition word, unfortunately, right? And that has a negative connotation. So right from the first word of the second sentence, I'm realizing, oh, okay, the author doesn't like something. And then he goes on to call employees controlling. Okay, well, that's also a negative word. And then later he says, ironically, right? I would say ironically isn't necessarily negative or positive in and of itself, but it's sort of a contrast to what he was saying before. So I've got a little bit of, even though I don't, you know, we're not really discussing the content of the passage, I have a sense just from these three keywords that like maybe the author is not fully happy about something. And then the second paragraph, it really stands out to me that he uses this word must, and he uses it twice. That's an extremely strong word. We see that word sometimes in critical reasoning questions, those must be true question types. And one of the trick of that question type is to differentiate between, actually we see this in quant too, don't we? Differentiate between a question that's asking what merely could be true from what must be true. Must is very, very strong definitive language. So as soon as I see must in this first sentence and then again in the second sentence, suddenly I'm like, oh wow, you know, the author really does seem to have an opinion here. And then later on, I see this keyword no, which is an extreme keyword. Words like no, none, never, always, those are always classified as extreme language, and we should be on the lookout for them. So he says that some sort of view is no longer viable, right? Viable meaning functional, workable. So if I count, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words that seem to show emotion, although I guess we could leave off ironically if you wanted to. It sort of stood out to me, but there's 5. And unfortunately is quite clearly negative. Must, you know, must become, must change if we consider the whole verb. That's very strong, quite passionate, and then saying that a view is no longer viable. So if I was sitting here and just looking at these keywords and trying to figure out, okay, is it I plus, or P, just by counting, there's 5 instances where the author is revealing a strong negative emotion. Therefore, this is a persuasive passage. I'm not going to read this whole analysis out loud to you, but feel free to pause, kind of read it, but it's basically just what we discussed. So it's interesting, isn't it, that we can ascertain the main idea without actually getting into the nitty-gritty of what the passage's topic is. So one of the mistakes people make when they read these RC passages is they're focusing too much on what it's saying. You know, if we go back for a second, you know, all this specific information of like human beings, corporations, superior performance, long-term corporate survival, blah, 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 right? That's all stuff that maybe a detail question would ask about. And if a detail question asks about it, we'll come back. You know, we'll come back and become an expert in that detail, but you don't need to become an expert in all the details on the first read. All right, so now we know this is a persuasive passage. We know that the tone is quite negative. So let's look at the main idea question for this passage. And this I will read. All right, primary purpose of the passage is to, as we said, the phrase primary purpose, that's sort of the dead giveaway. This is the main idea question. And one of the things that you might notice on main idea questions is that the first word of the answer choices is almost always a verb, and usually an infinitive verb. And that's exactly what it is here. Endorse, introduce, explain, contrast, propose, etc. And certain verbs are stronger than others, right? If we were to go through and classify this, A has endorse. Sure, that could be persuasive, you know, or at least I plus, but endorse is not going to be just purely informational. So endorse could work. Introduce and evaluate. Introduce is like, you know, not really that strong. Evaluate, okay, maybe a little bit more persuasive. C, explain and reconcile. You know, explaining, not really what the author is doing, you know, and reconcile, that's really incorrect, right? Because if anything, it feels like he's not reconciling something, he's complaining almost. D, contrast corporate structures. If you're offering a contrast, it's really just informational. You're just sort of comparing and contrasting. And then E, propose. That's also a very good persuasive verb. So if we were to kind of narrow it down here, right, endorse is quite good. Evaluate criticisms, that's quite good. Propose, also quite good. So of those three, evaluating criticisms, proposing an alternative, those are relatively negative, right? Criticisms is negative. If you're proposing an alternative, it means that you don't like something that's currently going on. And A, endorsing a traditional corporate structure. Remember, we go back to those keywords. He's saying, unfortunately, must become, must change, no longer viable. He's not endorsing the status quo. You know, he wants change. He wants something to be different. He has a negative feeling. So our final two here that really fit that tone is B and E. So I'm actually going to read both of them. B says, introduce a new approach to corporate leadership and evaluate criticisms of it. Here's where your sentence correction skills can come into play. It is a singular pronoun. And here, the antecedent, what do you think it is? Probably criticisms of this a new approach to corporate leadership. So introduce a new approach and evaluate criticisms of this new approach. Versus E, propose an alternative to a common corporate approach. So they're similar, but slightly different. B is focusing on introducing a new approach and then evaluating the criticisms of the new approach, whereas E is essentially proposing a new approach. So if I think B is the right answer, I think the structure of the passage goes something like this. You know, here is a new approach, and here are the criticisms of that new approach. Whereas E is saying, here is the new approach that I recommend. So I'll give you a second to think about those two. Make a guess as to whether you think the correct answer is B or E. And I know that's a little mean because we didn't really fully read the passage, but take a second. All right, so the answer is E. So the answer is E because the structure of the passage, he's not really introducing a new approach and then evaluating the criticisms of it. He himself is actually advocating for a new approach. You know, he is proposing an alternative to a common corporate approach. And again, even though we didn't read the full passage, just the language that we noted really supports the correct answer, E. Here's an example of how maybe your scratch work might look on test day. What I have in the parentheses here, where it's like too positive, you know, half info, intro eval, not neg enough. You know, obviously that's just kind of my own specific thought process. Yours doesn't have to look exactly like this. I would highly recommend, though, that for every RC question, you're writing out A, B, C, D, E, and you're at least putting sort of marks, whether it's plus, minus, question mark, some sort of process of elimination where you're not just crossing off the letter, but you're actually making a note of your impression of each answer choice as you go through it. All right, high score tip. Don't just pick an answer and don't fall in love with the first decently worded answer choice you come across, right? Just because you really like A doesn't mean you can be like, all right, well, now I'm prejudiced against B, C, D, and E. No, it doesn't work that way. The earliest answer choice that sounds good is not necessarily the correct answer. And often it's not, you know, maybe the correct answer is E and they purposely put a very well worded second best choice in the slot of A to sort of lure you in. So you need to work hard on your process of elimination. That's why, again, going back to that last slide, if you're not doing at least some work on your scratch paper when you deal with the questions, you are not doing enough strategy and reading comp. So prove to yourself why each answer choice cannot be correct, and record your impressions on your scratch pad. Respect the test's ability to tempt you with a promising second best choice. To avoid picking the second best choice, make sure to eliminate your answer choices. Scratch paper, write the reason for your elimination. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. Okay, let's do another passage. I'm gonna let you hit pause on the video. Again, you can find this passage on GMATClub if this is a little too tiny for you on the screen. And when you're ready, come back. All right, let's go to the next slide. So here, not as many juicy keywords as the last one. It starts out very informational. We're talking about GDP, they define what it is, a lot of more boring facts about GDP, unless you're very interested in GDP, and then it's not boring to you, but I find it boring. So a lot of boring information about GDP, right? This kind of chunk, this early chunk where there's a lot of dense sort of economic jargon and facts is the exact thing that is sort of designed to waste your time. So a student reading this from the wrong perspective is going to think, oh my God, I need to know everything about the GDP. It's like, no, you don't. That's not really what you're looking for in this first read. You're looking for, are there any keywords that tell me about the author's opinion and about the tone of the passage? And again, if there's a detailed question later that says, what is, according to the passage, what is the gross domestic product? Well, we know we'll go right back here and figure it out. But on that first read, you don't have to force yourself to understand every sentence. Okay, so these keywords that we have, ignores, okay, the GDP ignores something. All right, so it feels like the author has some slight negativity towards the GDP. Later on, he says, environment and the social structure have been eroded. Okay, well, if something is eroded, right, like erosion of a cliff, that's not a great thing. So again, not as strong as the last passage, but still slightly negative. And then later he says, not only does the GDP mask this erosion, okay, so it's another criticism there of the GDP, right? If you're accusing something of masking something, that's like saying it's obscuring it or it's hiding it. It's not necessarily a positive thing. All right, so think for a second whether you think this passage is informational plus a little opinion, or persuasive based on this language. And when you're ready, go on to this slide. So I hope you said it was informational plus, right? That is, this is basically your classic informational plus passage. A whole bunch of information. The author does have an opinion, right? He objects to the GDP. He says it masks something and it ignores something. So those are not positive verbs, but it's not as extreme as the last one. We're not really getting that same language like must twice and no, what was it? No viable, I've already forgotten. Oh, it was saying a point of view is like not viable or something, right? This one, and I believe last time there were five words or phrases in red, right? Here there's only 3. And like the 3 were not even super strong. So this is an I plus passage. So because of that, we're looking for an answer choice that, yes, does have a negative point of view about GDP, right? That's the author's point of view, but it's not so negative that we need like some crazy verb like, to refute, right? We're not looking for a verb like that. It doesn't have to be that extreme. All right, so just like we did last time, we're going to notice the verbs first, right? And again, just like the last main idea question, you'll see this common thread where the first word of each answer choice is an infinitive verb. When you have really wordy answer choices like this, the verbs can be a great place to start. So on the next slide, we're actually just going to look at the verbs for a second. So identify, suggest, examine, argue, and discuss. All right, so we're looking at these and we're like, okay, it's not a persuasive passage, right? So if I look at the verbs here and I'm looking for what's the strongest verb, argue is pretty strong, right? I had just said we are not looking for something like refute, right? We don't want a super, super strong verb because it's not a persuasive passage. So D would be probably the first one we could eliminate just on the basis of the verb. We wouldn't even have to read the whole thing, which is awesome. It's always good to save time in reading comp. All right, so then we've got these like 4 that are left, right? Identify, suggest, examine, discuss. It's probably a little bit harder to eliminate from here without reading more. I kind of say in this last paragraph that, you know, we could probably get rid of E because discuss is quite casual and informational. Yeah, I mean, it is. I would probably double check and read the whole thing, but if we had to, at this point, guess, D and E would not be the answer choices that we would guess. Okay, so let's look at those 3 that we have left, right? Just like we look at keywords in the passage, you can look for keywords in the answer choices to help you match it to the same tone as the passage. So I've sort of bolded the words that stand out to me in these answer choices. So let's read them. So A says, identify ways in which the GDP could be modified so that it would serve as a more accurate indicator of the economic well-being of the United States. B, suggests that the GDP, in spite of certain shortcomings, is still the most reliable indicator. All right, well, that's different, right? A is saying, like, how could we change the GDP so that it's more accurate? There's a little more negativity. B is saying that, you know, suggesting the GDP is still the most reliable indicator. Well, more is not as extreme a word as most, right? Most is the superlative form. So, well, by definition, that is extreme, right? You're like top of the scrap heap. If you're the most, if you are the best, the most, the fastest, you are number 1. So, you know, so that maybe could create some suspicion for us around B, knowing that this is an I+ passage and not a persuasive passage. All right, and then we've got C. Examine crucial shortcomings of the GDP as an indicator of the economic well-being of the United States, right? Crucial shortcomings, like A, it's negative, right? It's negative towards the GDP. So if we were stuck between 2, probably A and C would be our 2. All right, that's kind of what I'm discussing in this first paragraph. All right, and here's where it gets hard, right? It's challenging on this. You know, you're between A and C. They both have a negative attitude towards the GDP. And so you have to kind of really, really get into where the differences lie, right? A says, you know, we're basically here to identify ways the GDP could be changed so that it's more accurate, right? Which would imply the author thinks that currently the GDP is accurate. It just needs to be more accurate, that we could make it better. Whereas C is slightly more negative, right? Examining crucial shortcomings of the GDP. He's not saying that it's currently accurate. So this is where you might have to go back to the passage. It's like, does he offer any praise of the GDP in terms of its accuracy? If he says, yeah, it is accurate, we just need to make it better, okay, well then A is our answer. But if he doesn't say that, if he doesn't praise the GDP at all, and the whole thing is nothing but negativity towards the GDP, well then C is gonna be our correct answer. So I'm gonna give you a second if you wanna look back through the passage here. Look one more time at these red sections, right? He says the GDP ignores. He says the GDP, that certain things have been eroded. And he says that the GDP masks this erosion, right? So we're missing positivity towards the GDP. He doesn't say at any point, oh yeah, the GDP is really accurate and isn't that wonderful? And it just needs to be made more accurate. Nope, right? Not enough, well, not really any praise, to be honest. Although I guess it's nice that he says, you know, chief indicator of economic well-being. I guess well-being is a good thing too, but not that great. All right, so the correct answer here is in fact C. Whoops, let's go back, read it one more time. So it's this one, right? Examine crucial shortcomings of the GDP, because that's what it's doing. It's not saying, oh, here's how the GDP could be modified so that it's more accurate. No, he doesn't say the GDP is accurate and that's so great. The whole passage is like, negative, negative, negative. Not so negative that it's a full-on persuasive passage, but negative enough that it both presents information about what the GDP is and then ultimately offers some negative opinion towards it. Right, I'm just gonna leave this slide up for a couple seconds just in case you wanna read this analysis here, although we've talked about it pretty much. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on. All right, strategy tip. Main idea is not going to be based on one sentence alone. I have to say that in that very serious voice, because many times a student will, the last sentence of the passage will end with an opinion, and the student will say, oh, look, there's a very strong opinion in the last sentence, therefore the whole passage is persuasive. And it's not, you know, it is I plus. So one sentence is not going to make or break it. It's about how all these keywords work together and how they're scattered throughout. If there is a powerful thesis, which it would be the last sentence of the first paragraph, or there's a strong sentence at the very end of the passage, ask yourself how it perhaps relates to the rest of the passage. It might build on an earlier, smaller idea. You have to kind of trace that thread. All right, this is going to be our last passage, so go ahead and pause the video. Again, you can find this passage as well on GMATClub if you prefer to read it there. This one's longer, 4 paragraphs. So again, you're going to be looking for keywords that reveal the author's opinion, emotion, or gives you ideas about what the tone might be. So think about whether this is I plus, or P. And when you're ready, start the video again. All right. Here we go. Lots of interesting keywords here, right? I probably went a little crazy here with the red, but there was like a lot of interesting things that stood out, right? A key decision required of managers is whether blah, blah, blah. Okay, so required is quite strong. Then we have this topic sentence of the first paragraph that says one positive aspect of hard sell is blah, 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 blah. Okay, so he seems to have, you know, positive aspect or positive opinion on hard sell. But then he says, however, okay, so maybe there's also some negative to hard sell. Interesting, right? Later, I didn't highlight this, but that's an important word, phrase too, by contrast. By contrast, something is greatly reduced with soft sell, right? Some sort of risk is greatly reduced with soft sell. So maybe that's a plus for soft sell, right? Later he says implicit conclusions reduce risk of blah, blah, blah. So something that's reducing risk is inherently a good thing, right? So he mentions a positive of hard sell, then a negative about hard sell, and now he goes on to start to praise soft sell. Whoops, sorry. Third paragraph. Then he says another advantage. Okay, great. Another plus to soft sell. Then fourth paragraph, despite this, they may not always be more effective. This word may is incredibly important, right? We were talking earlier about the word must. May is like one sort of, well, it's a little bit more middle of the road, right? May is like could, might, maybe, that kind of language. And then to conclude, they give us a list of risks, right? One risk, blah, blah, blah. Another risk, finally, a third risk, right? So if we think about this passage, right, the author kind of goes back and forth a lot. It's like, here's one positive thing. However, and then he's like, oh, look, this risk is greatly reduced. And then he talks about an advantage. Okay, but then he goes, may not always be more effective. And he goes one risk, another risk, a third risk. It's very even-handed. You know, he's sort of like, it feels like he's analyzing the pros and cons of something. So if it is even-handed like that, then it's probably an I plus passage. You know, if the author is like, we have two approaches, here's the pros and cons of this approach, here's the pros and cons of this other approach. Yeah, he's not really taking a firm side. So you really have to chart that language to be able to pull that out. Again, most students are going to be obsessed with trying to figure out what the hell hard sell and soft sell actually means. Doesn't matter, you know, it really doesn't matter what the specific topic is and whether or not you're familiar with it. It's about these keywords. So our notes could look something like, you know, point of view, maybe hard sell, like sad face, but soft sell, maybe like happy face and sad face. He's got a mixed point of view. And our overall purpose here is I plus, right? To give information plus a little tiny bit of opinion. So for the main idea, correct answer, we need something that is I plus. Can't be purely informational. It can't just say, it can't be something like, you know, to describe soft sell and hard sell. Like, no, that's too informational. But on the other side, it can't be too persuasive either. Can't say, you know, to pick hard sell over soft sell. It's like, no, like that. Excuse me. That doesn't work either. All right, I'll give you a second to sort of read anything else you'd like to on this slide, although we sort of discussed it all. Okay, moving on. Here is the question. Primary purpose of the passage is to, and I'll go ahead and pause for a second. You can read these. And when you're ready, let's move on. Okay, so hopefully you were able to get rid of A and B as being too extreme. Just going back 1 second, point out risks, right? That's very tricky because we noticed the word risk multiple times in the passage. So many students will be tempted by A. Also notice that A is in the A slot, right? That's very tempting. Point out risks. You'll be like, oh, I remember reading the word risks. Yeah, I like this one. And then you're going to judge B, C, D, and E because you already have sort of half decided that you like A and think the answer is A. So we don't want to do that. Point out risks is one-sided. You know, he's not saying anything positive. So it doesn't fit what's really going on in this passage. B, make a case. Should say for, make a case for, not make a case or, that doesn't make sense. Make a case is like propose, you know, it's persuasive phrase and doesn't fit. So E as well, contrast the types of markets for which two advertising strategies are appropriate. We're not contrasting the markets, we're contrasting the actual strategies themselves. So contrast was a pretty good verb, but E is really off topic. So that leaves us to our final two, C and D. And I'm going to go ahead and read both of them. So C says, illustrate the ways in which two advertising strategies may be implemented. I mean, I love the word may, right? And again, just like A is very tempting because the word may, we saw that in the passage. So you might be thinking, oh yeah, you know, this kind of seems to match the tone because I remember reading the word may and here's the word may again. So it must be a perfect fit. It's like, yeah, that's what they would like you to think. It's what makes this a harder main idea question. And D, present the advantages and disadvantages of two advertising strategies, right? So is it more about illustrating how we could implement them, or is it about presenting pros and cons? And as we discussed, first paragraph mentions explicit conclusions, and then the next two discuss implicit conclusions, hard sell versus soft sell. And there was a yin-yang aspect to the passage, pros and cons. Therefore, D is obviously the right answer. Maybe not so obvious, but hopefully obvious now that we've talked about it. All right, that is it for today. I hope this gives you a little bit of information on what you should truly be looking for in that first read of the passage. I know I haven't really made any videos yet about like how to actually do notes on the passage. So this was purely just focused on main idea. So that's kind of what I focused on. I don't necessarily recommend that you write out all those keywords, but you certainly can if you want to train yourself to notice them more. It's not a bad strategy in the beginning as you're working on just improving your skills, but on test day, you probably wouldn't be doing that. If you have any specific questions, either about reading comp strategy or main ideas, feel free to ask them in the comments below. I hope this was valuable to you, and I look forward to doing more reading comp content in the future.